Hi guys, so I'm going to talk about the similarities and differences between Alzheimer's and another brain disease, Huntington's disease. Alzheimer's is a chronic neurodegenerative disease that worsens over time. Huntington's disease is an inherited disorder that also leads to the death of brain cells. Although Alzheimer's can be inherited too, unlike in Huntington's disease, it is not the cause of a single gene. So with that, I'm first going to discuss the genetic differences between the two diseases. In Alzheimer's, changes in the brain can take place over decades before cognitive problems appear. Alzheimer's disease is considered a protein misfolding disease caused by plaque accumulation of a atypically folded amyloid beta protein and tau protein in the brain, which is pictured on the right. These plaques of amyloid beta are a fragment of amyloid precursor protein, APP, which is critical for neuron growth and survival. The depicted abnormal plaques and tangles lead to the loss of connections between neurons in the brain and thus the death of these diseased nerve cells. This loss results in severe atrophy of the affected regions, as displayed on the right, including destruction of the temporal lobe and parietal lobe, as well as the frontal cortex and cingulate gyrus. While Alzheimer's evolves as a result of a variety of factors, Huntington's disease is caused by a single defect on a single chromosome. The HTT, or Huntington gene, is located on chromosome 4 and contains a sequence of 3 DNA bases, cytosine, adenine, guanine, repeated multiple times. CAG is the 3-letter genetic code for the amino acid glutamine. Most people have less than 36 repeated glutamines, which results in the production of the protein Huntington. However, a sequence of 36 or more glutamines results in the production of characteristically different proteins. This mutant form increases the decay rate of neurons and affects different parts of the brain depending on where these neurons are localized. Huntington's disease is considered an autosomal dominant disease inherited from either the mother or the father. Any child, regardless of the sex, has a 50% chance of undergoing the disease, as Huntington's does not skip generations. Occasionally, although rare, spontaneous cases of the disease occur with no familial links. In Alzheimer's disease, there are two kinds of genes that are associated with a familial risk factor. The first is a risk gene, known as APOE4. A person has 0, 1, or 2 APOE4 alleles, as displayed in the picture. Having more than APOE4 alleles increases the risk of developing Alzheimer's. However, inheriting an APOE4 allele does not mean that a person will definitely develop Alzheimer's. The other gene is a deterministic gene, which means the individual is guaranteed to develop Alzheimer's. However, this is much rarer than risk genes. People can be affected by Huntington's disease during their late 30s and 40s, but can be seen in adolescence, depicted in the graph to the right. Because Huntington's disease can be passed down, sadly children can be born before symptoms appear in the mother or father. Contrary to Huntington's disease, Alzheimer's generally affects people much later in life, usually those older than 65, depicted to the left. However, early onset Alzheimer's can affect people from late 30s or early 40s, like Huntington's disease. Both Alzheimer's and Huntington's disease typically progress slowly in 3 general stages: mild or early stage, moderate or middle stage, and severe or late stage. As you can see in the picture on the left, or in the picture on the left, the Huntington's disease affects different parts of the brain and it spreads over time, as well as in Alzheimer's disease, it starts in one part and spreads. In the early stage of Alzheimer's, the affected individual undergoes the increasing impairment of learning and memory, which leads to a diagnosis. The disease does not affect all memory capacities equally, as episodic semantic memory and implicit memory are affected to a lesser degree than new facts or memories. Language problems can also arise as a result of a decreasing vocabulary and a shrinking word fluency. However, the individual is typically able to maintain an adequate degree of communicating. Similar to Huntington's disease, performing fine motor tasks and certain movement coordination may be present. may be difficult. Individuals in the early stage can typically function independently, but may need help with cognitive demanding activities. In the early stage of Huntington's disease, there are subtle changes in coordination, including some involuntary movements. This is essentially guaranteed, while in Alzheimer's it's not. Often the affected individual has difficulty thinking through problems like those who suffer from Alzheimer's and often have a depressed or irritable mood. The effects of the first stage of Huntington's disease are considerably more influential on daily activities and decreased functionality doing customary things. In the moderate stage of Alzheimer's, affected individuals are unable to perform everyday activities and the disease hinders independence. Difficulties communicating become clear due to an inability to recall vocabulary, which leads to frequent incorrect word substitutions. This tends to eventually lead to the diminished ability to read and write effectively. Motor movements become less coordinated, similar to Huntington's disease as well. Also, during this phase, memory problems worsen, and the affected individual may not recognize close relatives. Long-term memory, which was not affected in the first stage, becomes greatly impaired as the disease spreads throughout the brain. Often behavioral changes can occur, including increased irritability and aggression, as well as about 30% of people with Alzheimer's develop delusional symptoms. In the middle stage of Huntington's disease, the movement disorder becomes a more serious problem. Medication for involuntary movements can lessen the symptoms, and physical therapists may be able to help maintain control of voluntary movements. Like in Alzheimer's, significant changes in thinking and reasoning abilities can occur. Diminished speech and difficulty swallowing is due to the lack of control over one's body. Ordinary activities become significantly harder to do. During the final stages of Alzheimer's, the affected individual is completely dependent on others for their care. Language is significantly reduced to basic phrases or single words, which leads to the absolute inability to communicate. However, those affected can often interpret and return emotional signals. Although aggressiveness can still be present, extreme apathy and exhaustion are much more common symptoms. Those affected won't be able to perform even the most basic tasks independently due to the extreme deterioration of muscle mass and mobility, like feeding themselves, for example. The disease typically progresses without remission over 3 to 9 years, and the cause of death is usually an external factor, such as infection or ulcers or pneumonia, and not the disease itself. In the late stage of Huntington's disease, the affected individual is completely dependent on others for their care, like in Alzheimer's. Jerky, uncontrolled movements may be severe, or it may cease altogether. At this point, the affected individual can no longer walk and will be unable to speak. However, he or she is typically able to understand others and retain a sense of awareness of their loved ones. The disease typically progresses without remission over 10 to 20 years. Death for the affected individual is usually due to infection, pneumonia, heart failure, or choking. As with Alzheimer's disease, there is no cure for Huntington's disease. In order to maximize one's remaining life, nutrition and diet are really important, as is social support. Throwback to Venicio's photo. There are also medications that can help make some of the symptoms, such as irritability, aggression, depression, mania, or psychosis, more bearable. These medications include, for both Alzheimer's and Huntington's, depending on the symptoms, antipsychotic medications, antidepressants, tranquilizers, and mood stabilizers. So thank you for bearing through my presentation. Yeah. Bibliography. Okay, great. Bye.